This is Steve, a computer science student who's pretty much a genius. He lived with his friend Joe, who's a really talented painter. When Steve was a kid, his family was doing pretty well, but then he got sick. Both of his parents had to work their butts off and even take on debt to cover his medical bills. After that, they were living in poverty. Even though Steve got better, he couldn't shake the guilt of knowing he was the reason his family went through such a tough time. Steve was desperate to help his family's financial situation, so he was willing to do whatever it took, even if it meant trying to get a loan from the bank. But because he was still in school, the bank wasn't going to give him a loan easily. In the end, he reached out to Howard, a scammer who could help him get a bank loan quickly. Howard and his buddies worked together in a business to help people get loans from the banks. He and his friends came up with fake data that their clients could use to trick the bank system. Then Howard would coach his clients on how to act so they looked believable during their interviews with the bank staff. He even faked their job information to make the bank more likely to trust them and give them big loans. On that day, as soon as he got his loan, Steve rushed to send the money to Joe and told Jason that the bank turned down the loan. He even showed his empty bank account to prove it. He went as far as getting his friend Sarah to pretend to be a bank employee and confirmed to Jason that the loan was rejected. It turns out Steve had a side hustle with his buddies, running a high-end shopping site. Turns out, though, all the fancy stuff he was selling was just knockoffs. After scoring some cash from the bank, Steve blew it on a knockoff watch. He got Joe to help him make it look legit. Meanwhile, Sarah pulled a fast one on Steve. She schemed and conned him, walking away with $138 million of his money before he even knew what hit him. Meanwhile, Jason told Howard that Steve didn't get the loan. Howard figured out that Steve had tricked them. This made Howard's partner, Eric, really mad. Eric was a ruthless guy who would do anything to get back at someone who crossed him. So he tortured Jason for messing things up. One day, Howard finally tracked down Steve. He knew Steve was super smart and he wanted to convince him to join forces, knowing his skill would be a great asset for the business. Steve's joining the team wasn't supported by Eric at first, but Howard convinced him that Steve would be a valuable addition. It was then that Steve learned that Jason, who was Howard's right-hand man, had been demoted because he had scammed him. Steve asked Jason to partner up because he knew Jason was reliable and could help him with the practical stuff while he handled the ideas. He was confident they would make a great team. From then on, Steve and Jason worked hard to find clients and tackle their projects. Before long, they were raking in loads of cash and impressing Howard with their work, but their success also made Bill, Howard's right-hand man, super jealous. He didn't like seeing Steve becoming the golden boy of the office. That day, they got a client who needed a loan from the bank. Howard asked Bill to go with the client to help convince the bank to approve the loan, but because the client was careless, their plan nearly got found out. Bill freaked out and ended up messing up the job. This screw-up forced Howard and his buddies to relocate their HQ. If they didn't book it, Howard was convinced the cops would nab them in no time. Their only option was to bail and vanish as far as they could. In the meantime, the cops got a tip about some shady stuff going down at some banks. They figured out that some folks were lying about their jobs to score loans, and there was a crew helping them out. Even though they knew these guys were fabricating stuff to fool the bank, most of the detectives didn't think it was a big deal. Not with Detective Nate, though, as he was all over it, while his partners didn't think it was a priority and brushed off the reports. That night, Joe told Steve that cops were keeping an eye on the neighborhood. He warned Steve to watch out, thinking the cops might be after him. The next day, Steve went to meet Detective Nate, who was hanging up a poster about his team's crime case at that moment, to try and get some new clues. He acted like just a no one who didn't know what was going on. With his innocent look, he offered to help Detective Nate out, and thanks to his phony kindness, Detective Nate was totally fooled, not realizing the person he was looking for was right in front of him. Detective Nate came back to his office not long after. He wanted to talk about the case, but his buddies didn't think it was a big deal until they found out about this person who was one of Howard's clients and was being threatened to pay the debt. Once they heard that, they finally started taking the case seriously. After filing the report, Detective Nate hurried over to Howard's headquarters. Surprisingly, Howard was in his office at that moment. They finally met and Howard seemed really anxious about getting caught, but he tried to act calm to avoid suspicion. He even lied to Detective Nate to get him to leave, but Detective Nate didn't buy it and started to suspect him. Eventually, Howard had to make a run for it when it became clear that Detective Nate was onto him. It turns out that Bill was the one who tipped off the police. Luckily, Howard and the others got away and saved themselves, but that whole thing made Howard realize it was time to stop. He gave all the customer data he'd been using for his business to Steve because he thought Steve could handle it better. Steve decided to start the business from scratch again. He brought in his old buddies to work with him and promised to split the profits evenly and take care of their well-being. This time around, he used a more advanced method in his business. While Howard used posters to promote their business, Steve turned to online advertising. He named his website OneLine, a business service that assisted clients in getting loans. He created OneLine as a solution for people who urgently needed money but couldn't secure a loan. Thanks to OneLine's many perks, they quickly attracted lots of customers and started raking in more cash than when Howard was in charge. Steve began sending money to his parents with the money he had saved up because he really wanted to improve his family's situation and help them get out of poverty. However, his mother didn't want the money as she only cared about his well-being and having a stable job. She believed that the money was worthless if her son's life was at risk. On the other hand, Eric always had these grand ideas for growing the business back when he was still working with Howard. He wanted to team up with big banks to make even more money, but Howard wasn't into it. He just wanted to help people in need. He felt like partnering with a bank was too focused on profit, and that didn't align with his values. This caused a huge rift between them, and they ended up going their separate ways. Eventually, Eric teamed up with Bill and made connections with some bank directors to bring in new customers. He made it clear that he was the boss and everyone had to follow his orders. He also made it known that he won't hesitate to cut ties with anyone who doesn't comply. Before anyone knew it, Eric's business took off like crazy. He was able to make his dream of starting his dream business he called Mirai Capital a reality, all because of his partnership with big banks in Korea. He got a ton of customers and started raking in the cash. But then he realized he had some serious competition with Steve's company, OneLine, and it got him feeling like they were rivals. On the other side, OneLine had a new goal in mind. After feeling really good about his current accomplishments, Steve wanted to make even more money. Sarah had the idea to use insurance as security for their debt. It was risky for the customers, so Steve's other friends weren't on board, but Steve was determined to get richer, so he went with Sarah's suggestion. This choice left his other friends feeling let down and left him. The next day, Eric showed up at OneLine's office and completely trashed the place. He was territorial and didn't want any competition. He felt like Steve was trying to steal his success, so he warned Steve to stay out of his way with this. Meanwhile, Bill, who came with Eric, stole customers' data from OneLine to give to his own company. Sarah quickly went to Eric and offered to be his assistant because she knew he was stronger than Steve. She was ready to do whatever it took to join his team because she wanted to be on the winning side from the start. Steve was on his own. All his friends had left him. He decided to meet Howard, his old boss. Since calling it quits, Howard had been holed up in his apartment, enjoying the fat stack of cash he'd saved up during his working days. Steve wanted to team up again, but Howard was done with the business. Instead, he suggested Steve meet with a friend of his. Shortly after that, they run into Director Baker, a bank director who didn't work with Eric. He'd been in the business for a while, so he had a list of companies in debt that he was convinced were about to go bankrupt because they couldn't pay off what they owed. Howard decided to use this info to help Steve in his fight against Eric. The next day, Howard caught up with Eric. He initially said he just wanted to reconnect with his old pal who he hadn't seen in a while, but then Howard dropped the bomb that someone else wanted to meet him, Director Baker. Director Baker then came along, introduced himself, and pitched a business deal to Eric. It promised big bucks, and Eric was seriously considering taking him up on it. On the other hand, Steve came back to visit his folks who had downsized to a smaller house. He was shocked by their move since he had been regularly sending them money. It turned out that his mom still refused to use the money because she didn't know where it came from. Finally, Steve came clean about his job, explaining that he wanted to help others easily access money by helping them get a loan. He felt guilty for causing his family to struggle in the past and wanted to make things right. His dad reassured him that their hardships weren't his fault and that his health was what mattered most. After meeting his parents, Steve thought about why he was still doing this business. He eventually managed to steal Mirai Capital customers' data from Bill. Then he planned to look into the clients individually. The next day, Steve started looking into it and discovered that all of Eric's clients were being treated horribly. Some people were deliberately mistreated until they ended up in the hospital, just so their insurance would pay out and they could pay their debts. There were even some people who ended their own lives because they couldn't afford the high interest rates on their loans. This goes against Howard's original principle. The scam network he set up was supposed to help people in need, not make their problems worse. Steve then spilled the beans to Detective Nate about how Detective Nate's bosses were involved in Eric's crime, which is why the police never took the case seriously. Steve owned up to his actions and also opened up about his family's financial struggles. He confessed to taking over Howard's sketchy business, even changing the name to One Line, knowing it was illegal. He was ready to face the consequences because he knew he was breaking the law. Then he dropped the bomb about Mariah Capital's dark secret and the evidence he had and asked Detective Nate to catch Eric first before anything else. Detective Nate decided to trust Steve and team up with him to expose Eric's shady business. Not only did Steve and Howard make their move against Eric, but Steve's friends, including Sarah, were also on board. With Sarah's support, who still had access to Mariah Capital, Steve and his crew were able to move over $2 million from Mariah Capital. After Steve successfully moved all of Eric's cash to his own account, Detective Nate finally caught Eric. Then Nate went after Steve too, knowing he was in on it, but Steve slipped away with Howard's assistance. Steve and his buddies totally got all of Eric's cash and used it to pay off everyone's debts. Then he gave the leftover cash to people who could really use it. From the get-go, he didn't start his business to create more problems. He just wanted to help out.